When I talk about debt, in particular with the United States, being applies to any country, I focus on the debt to GDP ratio, because you can't really talk about debt in isolation without thinking about the capacity to pay the debt. In a simple example, if you have a $50,000 balance on your credit card and you're making $30,000 a year trying to pay rent in New York, etc., good luck. You're probably going to go bankrupt or at least default on that card. But if you owe $50,000 on your credit card, but you're making $5 million a year, it's you just write a check. It's no big deal. My point is, you can't look at a $50,000 debt and decide if it's a problem or not unless you compare it to the income. And if it's too low, it's a problem. And if the income is high, not a problem. So that's why you use the debt to GDP ratio. The US just hit $31 trillion national debt, almost all of it in the form of US Treasury securities. Not all of it, there are other obligations, but mostly US Treasury securities. Well, is that a problem or not? Well, one way to answer the question is compare it to GDP, do the ratio. The answer is that ratio is now a little over 130%. At the beginning of the Trump administration, it was 106%. So Trump and Biden together have taken up 25 percentage points from 106 to 131. What was it in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected? The answer is 30%. 30% is completely comfortable. That's like the person with the $50,000 debt is making millions. No big deal. 50%, yeah, getting up there. Angela Merkel and all her years in Germany, and there's a lot of research to back this up, says that 60% was the limit. And that's what the Maastricht Treaty that created the European Union and the European Central Bank, that was their goal. They said, don't go over 60%. If you do, you're expected to take measures, raise taxes or reduce debt or reduce spending, do something to get that back down under 60%. What's the critical threshold where, water turns to steam, or water turns to ice, or something changes in such a way that it's not the same? It's radically different, but it happens very quickly. The best research says the answer is 90%. When your debt to GDP ratio goes over 90%, your multiplier of an additional debt goes below 1. So just to put that in context, at 30%, if I borrow $1 and spend $1, I might get $1.30 of growth. Assuming you spend it wisely, that's a big condition. But you borrow $1 and spend $1 and get $1.30 of growth. Okay, the debt was productive if you put it to good use. That $1.30 gets smaller and smaller. As you get closer to 90%, it goes to $1.20, $1.10, $1.05. Past 90%, you borrow $1 and you spend $1 and you only get 95 cents of growth. You don't get your dollar back in terms of GDP. And then 90% and 85%, et cetera. So 90% is the critical threshold. The US is at 131%, highest in history, which means we are well past the point where you can borrow your way to growth, where you can borrow your way out of a debt crisis. And we were heading for a debt crisis. Now, debt crises of that magnitude, by the way, if you ask a separate question, say, well, who else is at that lunch table? Who else has a debt to GDP ratio of about 130% or higher? The answer is Lebanon, Greece, Italy. Those are your mates at the lunch table. That's where the United States is. Now, Stephanie Kelton, she's the big brain of modern monetary theory. She's a professor at State University of New York. She says it doesn't matter. Yeah, they always point to Japan. Japan is at 280%, way past any member of the peer group. China's probably higher. China's a little more opaque because they are, but also they don't have as much national debt. If you look at the national debt to GDP, it's modest, but they have an enormous amount of provincial debt, and banking system is owned by the government or controlled by the government. When you're talking the bank debt, the state-owned enterprises, the provincial debt, and the government. So that's the real national debt. I was in south of Nanjing. They had these ghost cities. I went out to see them. They're real in the sense that it's steel and glass and copper and cement and asphalt, and they got country clubs and hotels and luxury apartment buildings, etc. And then you look down the horizon, not too far, maybe 7 or 8 miles, there's another one. And then in the distance, there's another one. They're all empty. They're all empty. But you can create 20,000 jobs for 2 years if you do something like that, or 3 years or longer. But all that money is wasted. Well, that's kind of, tells you a lot about China. But the point being, it was all debt financed and a lot else besides. So Stephanie Kelton says it doesn't matter because you're borrowing in your own currency. So if you're Argentine and you borrow in dollars and you print pesos, how are you going to pay the dollars back unless you have, huge trade surpluses, which they don't. So they just default. Argentina is a serial defaulter and everyone expects that. If you borrow in dollars and you print dollars, which the United States does, they're like, what's the problem? Just print the dollars and pay the money back. Well, that's true. If you print dollars, there's no reason to default on dollar debt because you actually can print the money and buy the bonds. But it doesn't mean nothing else bad happens. What about inflation or hyperinflation? What about foreign exchange rate? The exchange rate can collapse. And these modern monetary theorists show very little understanding of the international aspects. They treat the U.S. like a closed economy, which it's not. If it were a closed economy and we didn't have to worry about trade deficits, trade surpluses, capital flows, exchange rates, foreign credit, China owning $1 trillion of U.S. Treasury securities, which they do. If you didn't have to worry about any of that, I think they'd probably still be wrong, but they'd have a better case. But you do. She says, well, we don't really need a bond market, a U.S. bond market. We only have a bond market as a favor to investors because it gives them a place to put their money. They say when inflation happens, raise taxes. And then, by the way, they also say you don't need a tax system because if you can just print the money, why do you have to collect taxes? And their answer is, we collect taxes to redistribute income. Okay, well, at least they're honest. I mean, it's kind of socialist model, but they're honest about it. If you ask the typical member of Congress and you define modern monetary theory, they'll look at you funny. They've either never heard of it or they certainly don't know what it means, MMT. We're acting in accordance with modern monetary theory. Whether they know it or not doesn't matter. The actual behavior of the Congress, and again, just go back to COVID 2020, because we talked about the debt to GDP ratio. So in around May or June 2020, Trump put through a $2 trillion COVID relief package. And that was when, the Paycheck Protection Plan, that was $800 billion, and everyone got the $1,200 check. And then at the end of December, at the very end of the Trump administration, they did another $1 trillion, almost. And that's when everyone got the $600 checks. And now you're up to $1,800. By the way, those checks, that is helicopter money. What the Fed does is nonsense, but when it's fiscal policy, not monetary policy, and you're handing out checks, that is helicopter money. And credit to Larry Summers for saying, you're going to get inflation out of this. Well, Biden comes into office in January 2021, and he's like, not to be outdone, he did his own COVID relief package. That was another $2 trillion. And that's when we all got the $1,400 checks. They handed them out. And then later that year, they did the $1 trillion infrastructure package. And then just to top it off, what we get recently was the just under $1 trillion Green New Deal, or I call it the Green New Scam. Well, and the baseline budget deficit, before everything I just described, the baseline budget deficit was about $1 trillion a year. So take $1 trillion for 2020, 2021, add on, $2 trillion for Trump's first package, $1 trillion for his second one, $2 trillion for Biden's first package, $1 trillion for the Green New Scam, and I think $1 trillion for infrastructure. That's $7 trillion on top of the $2 trillion baseline budget deficit. So that's $9 trillion piled on top of what was at the time about a $21 trillion national debt. So that's how we got to 30 trillion. That's how the ratio went from 106 to 131. These numbers are mind-boggling, and MMT says it doesn't matter. So, but it does matter, and it shows up the way I described earlier, which is it slows growth. You don't get growth. So best case for the U.S. is very slow, weak growth, which we saw from 2009 to 2019. Worst case is you throw a recession on top of that, which we're heading for, and the U.S. will be in fiscal